Thank you for joining me for another Quick Hits conversation. Today, I would like to talk about how can we build grit. Jim, you want to start us off?
Sure. The best way to build grit, I think, is to do something that's fun but hard, right? So as you know, my wife and I, Stephanie, we go mountain biking, and that always seems to push my buttons, and sort of push the edge of what I think I can do, and it's hard, but it's a lot of fun. One of the cool things about grit is there's a few types of grit. There's physical grit. Mountain biking is certainly gritty, if nothing else. You have emotional grit and you have mental grit. And I think grit translates pretty well, such that if you can develop grit in one part of your life, it can go into some of the other parts pretty easily. So worth doing and a lot of fun.
Do you have to notice that you have grit to be able to move it from one place to another?
That's an interesting question. I don't have an opinion on that, although I think it helps to have the confidence in yourself to say, hey, I've done this, I've done something similar to this, so we can handle it.
Interesting. James, what are your thoughts on how you build grit? I know you're a former athlete, so you're probably pretty gritty.
Well, I'm not going to blow my own trumpet like that. I actually approached this idea from a more sort of neuroscience point of view. I looked at grit as being like, if you imagine in a movie, that point when like the team are a million points down and it's raining and they're definitely going to lose and the clock's running out. I thought about resilience, and your resilience is your ability to withstand stress and the effects of cortisol. But I viewed grit as like being right in the red when the cortisol is winning and your front brain is shutting down and you're caught in this like seesaw moment of your front brain executive function is like running out, but you're trying to input emotional content to keep performing, keep going. Obviously, you have a capacity to do that before your limbic system and the cortisol and the adrenaline peak. You become overwrought, you become angry, or whatever your personal version of negative emotion is. And it's interesting that Jim mentioned building it in other activities, transferring it across, because actually, the way that you manage your emotions, the development of your prefrontal cortex, you can develop that in any way you like, be it through sport, weightlifting, going through physical and emotional hardship. And you can always tell yourself, I've been through worse. So that was my very scientific, very strange view of it there.
Very good. Yeah. Yeah, good stuff.
The whole idea that I haven't died yet, so I can probably do this. If you're alive, you've got grit. That's what we're saying.
As long as you don't kill yourself, it's okay.
Right?
Yeah, we've all survived something, haven't we?
Yeah. Melody, what do you think? Based on what Jim and James have said and your experience with grit, how do you think you can build grit?
I think Jim kind of like covered it in the fact that you build it from like within. It gets built from learning activities that like have hardship involved in them, that push you to a limit that, you've been there before and you know that you can do it again. And no matter what happens, you feel like you can just keep like moving forward. And so I think, for me, I find the question I constantly am asking myself as of recently, I have a 2-year-old. So, how do I build grit in her, right? Like I grew up in a big family and my dad was a busy bee and he constantly had new projects for us to do. So we always had stuff that we had to do. We got to go outside, it's 100 degrees and you're going to go out there and you're doing whatever activity my dad came up with. And I felt like that built grit. But then my daughter, she's 2, and how do I build that grit within her without making her have to go like outside when it's hot and do nasty activities that I have no desire to do? So I mean, that's kind of like where I think grit came from for me is like just persevering through those activities. And so it's very interesting topic to me, building grit in children as well as in people that come into the workforce. Today they say, millennials, they're the problem with the workforce. They don't know how to like finish a job or complete a job. And, I kind of border on that line of like that group. And so people are always like surprised at how gritty I am, I guess, and like hardworking. And so how do I build that in my peers when I'm trying to hire? How do I find grit? So for me,
I guess what we're saying is grit is developed by doing hard things. And if you're really gritty, then you do really hard things to make yourself grittier. But if you're not gritty at all, do you just find, is it possible to do little steps? Or can grit come in increment, or is it something where you have to like take a big step?
Yeah, I think it's better if you do it incrementally than if you have to do a big step, because sometimes that can be overwhelming, and sometimes you don't have a choice, right? Sometimes you just got to do it.
Right. Yeah.
Because of circumstances.
I think there's perhaps a kind of a tortoise and a hare way of looking at grit, like particularly if you're someone who doesn't display as being very gritty regularly, whereas other colleagues and people who have that kind of persona, that kind of tough, take it all on their shoulders personality, will just plow through stuff. What you mentioned, Robyn, that idea of breaking things into little chunks and actually work with your psychology. You can stand to do whatever this horrible thing is for 20 minutes. So do 20 minutes and then take a couple of minutes, do some breathing, read a magazine, take a break, step away from it, then come back and just keep adding those 20 minutes until hopefully your tortoise overtakes the hares and you've surprised yourself.
I have often said to myself, my brain can go without me breathing for 1 minute, which means I can do anything for 1 minute. That's how far sometimes I have to break things down to be gritty.
Yeah, I think there's a risk if you're not careful that you can lose grit if you don't exercise it. The idea is if you want to grow, you got to stretch. And if you can get to a certain level in your career, you can kind of get comfortable. Then little things seem like big things, and you don't want to do anything about it. And I think for that reason, it's good to have these habits that keep pushing your buttons. I think that's a good thing.
Is there a way to notice, to Melody's point, she's trying to hire people, is there a way to notice, like what kind of questions can you ask someone to determine if they're gritty? Do you ask them about challenges?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, going back to the book and going back to just general, can you even build grit in people, or is it something that they build in themselves? And I think a lot of grit comes from youth, like how you were raised. And so, yeah, I think when I'm hiring or when I'm looking to hire, I'm always looking at someone's childhood, and kind of that's something that is often the key indicator of how gritty they're going to be, is like things they did or what they find, like what they do in their free time. I always thought interviewing questions were kind of weird about that, when they ask you like, what do you like to do in your free time? Or, what did you do as activities when you were in high school? And you're like, why do you care about that? But for me, I think that helps see grittiness. Like what were they willing to like push themselves to do, like take on in addition to what was required of them? And that helps see how gritty they were.
So it sounds like what we're saying is if you want to build grit in yourself, stretch yourself, do something difficult, make yourself work at it. If you want to build grit in someone else, we haven't really touched on that. And that might be maybe that's a subject for another conversation, because we're right coming up at 10 minutes. And if you want to know if someone's gritty, start asking them questions about how they push themselves and what they do. And that will tell you kind of where they're willing to stretch to. So I do want to cut us off there because we are at 10 minutes, but thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It has been very enlightening and a lot of fun, and we'll do it again real soon.
Very cool. Thanks.